This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Not everyone is careful with your personal information, which might explain why there's a victim of identity theft every 5 seconds in the US. Fortunately, there's LifeLock. LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year by visiting lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
The NBA playoffs are here, and I'm getting my bets in on FanDuel. Talk to me, Chuck GPT. What do you know?
All sorts of interesting stuff, even Charles Barkley's greatest fear.
Hey, nobody needs to know that.
New customers bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets if you win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
21 plus and present in Ohio. Must be first online real money wager. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus vest that expires 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 536, The Red Army Strikes Back, Blood in the Snow. Last time, the northern half of Army Group South had been pushed away from the Don River, now setting up a new Axis line some 50 miles east of Kursk. The Germans had lost many of their allies, literally now dead or prisoner. And having a taste of a large victory, Stalin wanted more. And he would get it, as General Van Tutten, commander of the Voronezh Front, saw an opportunity and risked presenting to the Stavka additional operations. In short, like when Operation Saturn became Little Saturn, generals like Van Tutten would rekindle that eagerness to claw back even more territory from the enemy. This time, it would be to the southwest of Stalingrad, with the ultimate goal being Rostov-on-Don, and then Kursk. After General Manstein's Operation Winter Storm failed, by December 23rd, he had pulled back to the midpoint of the Semyansk Reservoir southwest of Stalingrad. But even here, he and his were not safe. To be sure, the Soviets had to redirect forces to check Winter Storm, which they did, but as the opening of Operation Little Saturn pushed the enemy away from the Don River to the north, an opportunity to revisit the original Saturn became possible. What had been the goal, starting all of this in the south, besides saving Stalingrad, was retaking Rostov-on-Don. If this could happen, then the enemy's ambitions would be wrecked in several ways. Thus, the Stavka gave Van Tutten's ideas a green light. On the other side of the chessboard, though it galled them, the Germans, in admitting that the Sixth Army was now lost, grew concerned about General Kleist's Army Group A being trapped in the Caucasus region, and its escape was a close-run thing. The Stavka had first sought to encircle and destroy Army Group A before it reached Rostov. So, on New Year's Day, 1943, the Southern Front, under General Malinowski, had his forces move out on the double. Their goal was to reach Rostov before Kleist did, while the other Soviet troops behind Kleist tried to close in on him. As this was a race against Army Group A, Malinowski's tanks and trucks covered 150 or 200 kilometers in 2 weeks. True, they had to fight their way through, which slowed them down, but by January 14th, they had crossed the Manch River, southeast of Rostov, by some 70 miles. Even better, the Manch Canal was also crossed, closer to the city, some 50 miles away, due east. But it was this slowdown that allowed Kleist and Army Group A to reach Rostov. They had won the race. The 4th Panzer Army was also able to pull back to Rostov, but that race quickly turned into a desperate fight as the enemy kept coming. With Army Groups A and Don together, their men defending the area in general was numbered at 764,000 with 700 tanks and 530 aircraft. But coming at them were just over 1 million Soviet troops with 1,200 tanks and 900 aircraft. The decision by the Stavka to pretty much shut down operations elsewhere and focus here in the south was seemingly about to pay off. The fighting grew more intense as the Germans realized the enemy was trying to encircle them. Still, this Salsk-Rostov offensive, Salsk is about 80 miles southeast of Rostov, and it was the goal of the Trans-Caucasus Front, was coming at the Germans with at least 4 armies, backed by mechanized and cavalry units. Considering that Army Group B was trapped in Stalingrad and help could not come from the north, the Axis forces at Rostov were unable to stop what came next. As pressure was put on the defenders immediately east of the city, other Soviet forces were making for Shakhty, 30 miles north-northeast of Rostov, Novocherkassk, only 10 miles north-northeast of Rostov, and Batansk, 15 miles south of Rostov. This, of course, spread out the defenders, not allowing them to close ranks. And the Soviet strategy was simple. They did not have to win outright in a battle, just make sure that the enemy could not leave without a fight. Thus, that would flush them out, making them fight as they retreated, which would make them vulnerable. By February 7th, these 3 towns were reoccupied by the Soviets. Still advancing, despite Hitler ordering that Rostov be held, the Soviet forces closed in. On February 8th, Soviet cavalry and mechanized units, along with the 44th Army, crossed the Don, which cut off German communications and supplies from the north. The next day, February 9th, the Soviet 28th Army crossed the Don south of Rostov. Lieutenant Colonel Gukas Madoyan, a battalion commander, was one of the first to enter Rostov proper. He and his men had captured the railway station, which the Germans needed. Thus, they attacked it again and again, in all, 26 times, over 6 days. But Madoyan and his men held on until reinforcements arrived. Having tried all they could, Manstein could see the writing on the wall. Besides, when this Soviet offensive had started, he was to the northeast of Rostov, quite in danger. So first Manstein pulled back to Rostov, then the Axis forces there withdrew and left the city on February 14th, heading west. Rostov-on-Don had been occupied for 205 days, and during that time, some 53,000 civilians had been compelled into forced labor, while another 40,000 were executed outright.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Of course, this was the Axis' second occupation of Rostov. The first had been from November 21st to the 29th, 1941. The second occupation, now ended, had started on July 24th, 1942, just weeks after Sevastopol had fallen to General Manstein. But having tasted the success of Stalingrad and these other operations, Stalin's desire to rid southern Russia of all enemy troops grew. Thus, several operations followed. After all, what was the point of having the enemy on the run unless you kept them running? So, going back a bit, another operation was the Mozdok-Starovpol offensive, which also started on January 1st, 1943. Here, the Stavka wanted enemy troops out of the Northern Caucasus, and the man to do it was General Ivan Mazlesnikov, commander of the North Caucasus Front, and under him were 4 armies and 1 air army. Close to where the furthest penetration of Kleist's 1st Panzer Army had been, the Soviet attack commenced there in early January, just northwest of Grozny. The Soviets were pushing the enemy intentionally to the northwest, 1, so they would leave the area, and 2, it was simply the best that could be done, as other Soviet operations had or were also about to start. There was only so many men to go around. Yet the 1st Panzer had not gone far when Kleist ordered his men to halt and dig in. In reaction, General Maslenikov wasted no time as he had his men attack to keep the enemy retreating. And in doing so, he had lost many men, but by mid-January, Kleist could see his position here would not hold. Also, as there were enemy operations to the north of him, if he was to try to stay here, it would be suicide either way. Thus, a general retreat was ordered, and as covered, they reached Rostov in time, only to join in on the losing fight. Next came the liberation of the port city Novorossiysk along the northwestern shore of the Black Sea of the North Caucasus. This operation, already covered in episode 527, helped push the German 17th Army back to the Kuban Peninsula. It may be remembered that the toehold obtained by Major General Konnikov was called the Little Land, which eventually became a part of Russian culture. And though it took the loss again of many Soviet troops, when the Russians firmly controlled the bay there, they were able to then seek out their next target. And yet, as this operation had started at Maikop, some 95 miles or 152 kilometers east of Novorossiysk, and was only one of several operations, the Germans were slowly realizing that their adversary had grown in sophistication in terms of sustained, mutual, and overlapping operations. In 1941, hell, as far back as 1939, when fighting the Finns, Moscow had showed itself unable to undertake such feats. But now it was a matter of needs must. So the Stavka got on with it. The final operation of the North Caucasus Strategic Offensive was the Timhorsk-East Offensive, which recaptured the land touching the eastern coastline of the Sea of Azov, or in between Rostov and the now trapped German 17th Army to Rostov's southwest. This was the latest starting offensive, as the Stavka needed to see if the others started out favorably enough. Thus, this was launched on January 24th. But as the Axis forces had retreated out of the North Caucasus, either to Rostov or to the Taman Peninsula, the fighting and reoccupying here was over by February 4th. In fact, most of their time had been spent walking or riding in trucks rather than fighting. The Germans were gone. Of course, this put these Soviet troops on the left flank of the now trapped German 17th Army on the Kuban Peninsula. The pressure on them would not abate. Stalin would see to that. Proving this, soon came the Krasnodar offensive operation, starting on February 9th. It was deemed time by the Stavka to wipe out the German 17th Army, so further operations could start to liberate Crimea. But one thing at a time. Besides, this would not be as easy as the Soviets were hoping. As covered in episode 527, the Soviets pushed on the German 17th Army from three sides: the northwest, east, and south, from the port city of Novorossiysk. The original goal had been to cut off the Axis retreat, surround them, and then destroy them, but that did not happen. One reason for this was the fighters of the Luftwaffe 4. They did good work in causing many Soviet casualties. Having said that, the Luftwaffe themselves would lose almost 170 of their own planes, being bled, as was the 17th Army. In early March, these three Soviet forces were pushing the enemy, who then counterattacked, again helped by their air arm. But despite the casualties suffered, the Russians kept pushing. Seeing this, the Germans fell back to a position about 40 miles or 65 kilometers west of the city of Krasnodar, whose liberation had been greatly cheered by the nation. As the Soviets had trouble maintaining this new defensive line, certainly with the Germans counterattacking every once in a while, the Stavka called off offensive operations here, now content to simply join up these three forces and form a new line. The enemy was now out of the Caucasus, bottled up on the Taman Peninsula, and Rostov was once again free.
From the creators of the popular science show with millions of YouTube subscribers comes the Minute Earth podcast. Every episode of the show dives deep into a science question you might not even know you had. But once you hear the answer, you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Why do rivers curve? Why did the T-Rex have such tiny arms? And why do so many more kids need glasses now than they used to? Spoiler alert, it isn't screen time. Our team of scientists digs into the research and breaks it down into a short, entertaining explanation, jam-packed with science facts and terrible puns. Subscribe to Minute Earth wherever you like to listen.
Meanwhile, after losing Rostov-on-Don, Army Group Don with the 1st Panzer Army retreated through the city, heading west just above the Sea of Azov. In a perfect world, these forces would have fallen back enough to line up with the retreating forces of the 2nd German Army and what was left of their allies, the Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians. But that would mean giving up cities like Mariupol and Melitopol without a fight, something Hitler would never countenance. But before anything could be worked out, the Soviets struck again, this time during the twin operations Star and Gallop. The goals of these attacks were the liberation of the towns of Kharkov and Kursk. Now, this was an ambitious goal for the Stavka, as Kursk was just over 100 miles west of Voronezh, where the attacks had started that ended the Italians. But confidence was creeping into the Russian officers and staffs. Besides, there were several factors on the Russians' side. First, the near destruction of Army Group B at Stalingrad, also the near destruction of Germany's allies along the Don River. Thus, the Voronezh front under General Golikov would work in tandem with the southwestern front under Van Tutten. For reference, the 3 major cities the Russians were looking to retake are located like this. Kursk, the most northern, is practically due west of Voronezh. Next, Belgorod is about 50 miles south and a little east of Kursk, while Kharkiv is due south of Kursk, so about 30 miles to the southwest of Belgorod. The Voronezh front got things going with the launch of its offensive on February 2nd with 3 tank armies. They were making for Kursk and Belgorod, the upper 2 cities, and with what was left of the Axis forces in this area, holes were quickly made in the Axis lines. And having stored up enough fuel, certainly since the attacks on Rzhev had been called off, the Soviet tanks were able to keep going. Kursk was captured on February 8th, and then Belgorod followed. Kharkiv turned out to be a harder nut to crack. Formed just before the Soviets arrived, Army Detachment Lance, commanded by General Hubert Lance, a part of Army Group Don, was formed up by what was left of the 2nd Army Corps, the 320th and 168th Infantry Divisions, and regularly arriving elements of the 1st and 6th Panzer Divisions. Thus, they fought as they came upon the scene, versus being set up to defend. And lastly, the remaining Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians. These last 3 groups were to have been moved to the rear areas per their capital's instructions, but Kharkiv, which had been recently a rear area, was now the front line. Thus, they were forced to fight to even have a chance to retreat once again. But what transpired was not a set battle or set defense per se. The tanks of General Golikov were coming at the enemy's line as that line was being formed. And considering that it was filled with exhausted frozen men, it wasn't much of a defense. Soviet troops entered the outskirts of Kharkov on February 16th, driving the defenders before them away. By the next day, the city was once again Russian. But even as the Soviets were celebrating, von Manstein was getting a better idea of what he still had to fight with. Also to the good, he realized that the enemy had just rushed 2 major armored forces some 100 miles, and they had fought for days without a break. They had to be tired, nearly out of fuel, and in need of standing down. In other words, open to attack, as Hitler was informed as he had just left the area after flying in to personally speak to Manstein. And seeing how precarious the situation was, Hitler had given Manstein operational freedom, which was rare enough. As the general had told his leader, a traditional counterattack would be fruitless. Any open territory we capture, we could not hold. However, it was possible for him to attack the overextended, exhausted enemy tank armies in the area with a view to retaking Kharkov. There, a solid defense could be set up. It wasn't his first choice, but to take the city would force the Soviets to fight for it again versus them just simply pushing the Axis forces further west. It was to be an anchor, and hopefully, later, a launching pad. Besides, the Axis forces were too tired to continue retreating, and they were running out of trucks. But they could stand and fight. What other choice was there? Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, I know this one hit kind of quick, but I'm trying to wrap up a lot of things, so now I can set up the Battle of Kharkov, and then we're going to bring the Americans into North Africa, because I've gotten a couple emails, people looking forward to that, and honestly, so am I. So, we'll do the Battle of Kharkov. We'll put a bookmark in mid-November 1943 on the Eastern Front and see what the Yanks are up to. So I'd like to welcome aboard the latest members. Let's see here. Stephen Whitby from the UK. Thank you very much, Stephen. Brian Adler from Missouri. Thank you very much. And as far as donations, Dean Purser from the Gold Coast, Queensland, Australia. Thank you very much, Dean. And Matthew Evans, who simply wrote Across the Pond. I'm assuming that's the UK. So Matthew, thank you very much. So again, we've set up Battle of Kursk. We'll go into that. And we'll see how it goes from there. And again, it was like the swan song of the Germans, one desperate thing. But even at this point, I mean, they simply don't have the numbers. They don't, not that they ever did, but they can't replace all the losses. And at the end of the day, in modern warfare, I think that's what it comes down to. Unless you can drive to the other person's capital, which was supposed to be what happened in late 1941, and make them capitulate, it's just not going to happen. As long as they're willing to take losses and keep fighting, which Stalin was, they're going to prevail. It's just a matter of when or how long. And again, that's pretty much what's going to happen on the Eastern Front. So we'll get to that as soon as we can. I do have some book interviews coming up, and they'll be sprinkled in there, and we'll go from there. So it's going to rain here all week. I hope you all enjoy wherever you're at, the springtime. But as soon as it finishes raining, then I'm going to have to go cut what was a lawn, but it will probably by then be a hayfield. Take care, everyone.